Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Lasserre-Cortez. I'm a senior researcher for the REL Southwest. Most of my research is done in the Louisiana Teacher Prep and Professional Development Partnership. I'm happy to be facilitating this webinar for you today, Research-Based Trauma-Responsive Education Practices. Our agenda today will start with an expert overview of trauma in schools. Our expert will align the webinar with local Louisiana context and needs. Then we will have a research-based trauma-responsive education practices from a neurocognitive and social-emotional relational perspective. We'll have our practitioner's perspective on how to create trauma-responsive school environment. And then we'll conclude with a discussion with our Louisiana Teacher of the Year, Kimberly Eckert, with her experiences with trauma-responsive practices in the classroom. Throughout this webinar, we will have 2 10-minute Q&A sessions, so make sure to write down your questions and put them in the chat box throughout the webinar. Our presenters today are Dr. Tammie Causey-Konaté. She is also with AIR. She is a Senior Technical Assistance Consultant. Dr. Amy Lansing, Assistant Adjunct Professor from the University of California, San Diego. Kathleen Guarino, a Senior Technical Assistance Consultant with American Institutes for Research. And Kimberly Eckert, Louisiana State Teacher of the Year from Bruley High School. The REL Southwest conducts its work through collaborative research partnerships with stakeholders in Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. The work of these partnerships is developed in consultation with state education agencies and district staff to address priority education issues in the region. The REL Southwest supports 6 collaborative research alliances with these states. REL Southwest conducts its work primarily through collaborative research partnerships with school districts, state education agencies, policymakers, and others in our region. These partnerships focus on high-leverage education issues that our partners or others in the field have identified as priorities. Through these partnerships, we conduct research to advance understanding of education issues, support regional stakeholders in building capacity to use data and evidence in education practice, and translate research into actionable resources and tools. This webinar today is in collaboration with the Teacher Preparation and Professional Development Research Partnership, which is based in Louisiana. The goal for today's webinar is to define and discuss trauma in schools and to provide educators with research-based trauma-responsive strategies and opportunities. Our outcomes are to gain a better understanding of what is defined as trauma among adults and children, become aware of the research base and evidence supporting trauma-responsive strategies and practices, and to learn how to create a trauma-sensitive classroom. The stakeholder feedback survey will be shared with attendees toward the end of the webinar, and it will be sent to all webinar attendees afterwards by email. This feedback is very important and helps us improve for future events. Our webinar today includes closed captioning. Follow these directions to set up closed captioning. If you have any technical issues with this process, please type your problem in the chat box and someone will assist you. Our first presenter is Dr. Tammie Causey-Konaté, a Senior Technical Assistance Consultant at AIR. She presently serves as Deputy Director of the Southeast Comprehensive Center, a $20 million regional comprehensive center that provides technical assistance to address state and local capacity building to further school improvement and equity. In addition, Dr. Causey-Konaté serves as consultant to AIR's Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, providing support with curriculum development in the area of social-emotional learning. Dr. Causey-Konaté has nearly 30 years of experience as a professional educator. with her years in K-12 and higher education divided equally. She has international and regional expertise in diversity and equity, cultural and linguistic competence, cross-education system partnerships, and the post-secondary development of school leaders for urban and rural education contexts. Dr. Causey-Konaté holds a Ph.D. in Educational Administration, a Master's of Education in Curriculum and Instruction, and a B.A. in Secondary Education English from the University of New Orleans. Welcome, Dr. Causey-Konaté.
Thank you, Shannon. Good afternoon, all. Today, I will begin by providing an overview of trauma in schools and exploring the current context in which our schools are operating. Our current educational and socio-political context acts to action for implementing trauma-informed education practices. Trauma-responsive practices are not a luxury. They are vitally necessary. All across the globe, the cry for trauma-responsive education practices resounds with the daily mention of violence, such as mass shootings, assault, domestic violence, rape, murder, suicide, bullying, hate crimes, substance abuse, sex trafficking, natural disasters, and so forth. We'll take a look today at some of the statistics that help us to realize the prevalence of potentially traumatic events for children from birth to age 18. I'll begin by defining for you what we know as trauma. So when we think about trauma, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which we call SAMHSA, defines trauma as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual physically or emotionally as harmful and life-threatening. These events have lasting adverse effects on individuals' functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. These are intense, overwhelming experiences that typically involve what we call the threat to life or well-being. They're direct, usually, but often they're observed or heard about. When we think about those observed or heard about or experienced indirectly, we sometimes think of those as adverse childhood experiences rather than as trauma according to the SAMHSA definition. We think of childhood trauma as a response to negative external events or series of events that may render a child temporarily helpless and surpass that child's way of coping and defending operations normally. The adverse childhood experiences, as you can see here, lend themselves very easily to some of the experiences that our children face daily. They include neglect, abuse, household dysfunction, things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, mental illness, the incarceration of a loved one, divorce or separation of parents, violence within the household, or substance abuse. And these adverse childhood experiences have serious implications for our children. When we think about what they do to the children, they put the children at elevated risk for different sorts of mental and physical health problems. First, there's a physiological change to the brain when a child experiences often or repeated adverse childhood experiences. And these may result in cognitive losses and physical, emotional, and social delays that change the way children engage with one another and with their adults or family members. These changes in the behaviors and experiences often result in poor school performance. And as these poor school performance behaviors are evident, we see an elevated risk for all sorts of things that move us from mental and physical problems to substance abuse, and eventually criminal justice. It often begins with juvenile justice. When we think about the types of adverse experiences we talked about just now and traumas overall, we know that we see in our world today an overwhelming instance of kids being involved, or at least observing. We have over 74, well, nearly 74 million children in the United States, and 26% of them experience a traumatic event before age 4. 14.8 million live in food insecure homes. 1.2 million are homeless. 2,805 are arrested every day. 8 are killed with guns daily. And when we think about those arrested, whether they're, 17 or 16, they're often experiencing some of the same things that adults experience. They're handcuffed, fingerprinted, they take mug shots, and in some cases, they have their DNA harvested. So we see the criminalization of youngsters early on. In America, from 2015 to 16, we had recorded 1.1 million serious offenses. 2.7 million students were given out-of-school suspension. Over 120,000 were expelled, and over 291,000 experienced law enforcement engagement. This exposure to these sorts of very adverse experiences, as you can see, have serious repercussions for students. When we think about it, for example, in Central City, a high crime area here in New Orleans, it's reported that some children have been exposed to so much violence early on that they experience PTSD rates higher than those of soldiers returning from war. In our Louisiana, we have the highest trauma death rates in the nation. We are ranked 27th among all states for suicide, 32nd in overall drug-related deaths, and 85% of our residents in the year 2016 and 17 were recovering from natural disaster. So as you can imagine, this has great implications for youngsters, whole families and communities in natural disasters and recovering from these sorts of trauma. We see that our students and our youth are being faced with all kinds of things, including residing in unsafe neighborhoods, dealing with incarceration of parents, concentrated poverty. And we know that they're experiencing multiple experiences and multiple forms of these adverse childhood traumatic incidents. So more locally, when we think about the ongoing school closures, we know that those have a traumatic impact because often students are separated from their teachers, from administrators and school leaders they love, from their peers because of school closure, all in the name of accountability. And we want that accountability, but we must think about the repercussions that our actions and our policies have for our youth. Racism and ethno-violence and marginalization are also adding to these adverse childhood experiences, together with culturally unresponsive practices in which folks who are perhaps well-meaning work with our youth and don't necessarily understand their culture. And so we might assume that a culture we don't understand is either lacking culture or it's really inappropriate. And so we must learn to suspend our assumptions and delve into, ask questions, make observations, and do some research to learn about what is culturally responsive within the context in which we teach. And then, of course, there are systemic barriers. We know, particularly for our LGBTQ community, we have learners who are not protected under the current policies for anti-bullying laws that really help them to remain safe in our schools. When we think about how these things play out, as educators, I'm sure you see it every day, we may encounter students who experience trauma, but rather than showing the face of trauma, we see them engage in ways that are disrespectful, hostile, violent, angry, or maybe they're withdrawn and quiet and hopeless. And so these behaviors that we can't quite pin down, we often approach in punitive ways. So these are behaviors that are likely to be punished or penalized. And so rather than examine the why behind the behavior, we judge the behavior and act upon it. So these behavioral extremes are what we would consider triggers for instances of potential trauma. You know, it's likely that when you see these behaviors, a student has experienced something that might call for the question, what happened to you? Instead of, why are you behaving this way? And so we definitely need to look at our children in a different light, begin to think about them as if each and every one of them is our own. And as we approach our own children, we often do so with curiosity, with love, without judgment. And so those are the kinds of things we must continue to bring to our interactions with the youth in our schools. So when we reconsider the systems that we operate within, we know that those protective factors that can help us mitigate against trauma are going to be critical. We saw the statistics, and they're staggering. When we think about the rates at which youth are being exposed to adverse childhood experiences and witnessing all kinds of violence and trauma, we know that we must do something. We're compelled to do something. The racism, ethno-violence, marginalization that we see played out in our daily lives and in our society, in our news, and other forms of media are definitely triggers for our youth. And so we must guard against those. And some of the ways we can guard against those are really to think about funding statewide and what it is that we can do with our vote to address that. We can think about engaging in more trauma-informed educational professional learning experiences such as the one we're having today, so that we have some tools in our arsenal to be able to mitigate against the trauma. We can think about the socio-political climate of violence and despair and how we can bring restorative practices, unconditional positive regard, asset-based thinking, trauma-sensitive and caring approaches to working with our youth, because they are our future after all. We consider the urgency. Just know that people who have experienced trauma are more and more likely to show evidence of that trauma across the continuum of their lives. 15 times more likely to commit suicide, 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop a sexually transmitted disease or to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to use antidepressants, 3 times more likely to be absent from work or to experience depression or have serious job problems, 2.5 times more likely to smoke and develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and 2 times more likely to have serious financial problems. So our goal here today is to begin to think together about how we can interrupt this cycle of trauma that is really taking its toll on our communities and our youth and challenging our potential for a great future. We know that children exposed to 5 or more significant adverse experiences in the first 3 years of their lives face a 76% likelihood of having 1 or more delays in their language, emotional, or brain development. The risks for depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, and all sorts of other things, including uncontrollable anger, family and financial and job challenges, increases as the number of traumatic events increases in childhood. And so with that said, we want to begin this way of thinking about recognizing and realizing the impact of trauma, its signs and symptoms, responding by integrating knowledge into policies and procedures and practices, and guarding against re-traumatization, because the cycle of trauma includes this emotional or physiological damage, then behavioral and learning problems, and then punishment or other punitive measures that come with that. And because of that punishment and penalization, often re-trauma. We must interrupt the cycle. And one way I'll ask of us to think about when we think about interrupting the cycle is to remember every student, every learner, as if that learner is our own. And in the words of John Dewey, what the best and wisest parent wants for his child, that must be one for all the children of the community. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. I'll leave you with a couple of resources. This symbol here, this graphic, is from my book, recent publication, and the process is Sankofa. Sankofa is an Agahan African word, means it's okay to return to the source and fetch those valuables left behind. So I urge you to tap into sources of strength among learners and among your peers, identify focal points for action to resolve these issues of trauma or at least address them, and to begin to try to strategize to transform towards social justice. More likely, you can begin to challenge marginalization, interrupt some of those negative narratives about trauma and the related events, empower and arouse agency among youngsters and your peers, and develop culturally sustainable solutions. Thank you so much for your time. And at this time,